If you had told me when I was a kid that Ford Poplars used to be cheap as chips when I was 10 years old, would have a line of admirers at a car show in Cheshire, I would never have believed you. Or that the Consul, the Ford Consul, will become not a consul but a king, one of the finest in show. Or that this beauty, Sunbeam Talbot, would become top of the show. I would never have believed you. Sunbeam Talbots were never shabby cars, but they were never regarded as the pinnacle of engineering and manufacturing excellence. But when I look around, as you'll see this car show, you'll realize just how ugly modern cars have become compared to their antecedents. In fact, almost the farther you go back, the more beautiful are the cars. You'll also see that whilst there are many millions of cars in Britain, almost none of them were made here. And even those that were made here are not made by companies that are owned here. It is a remarkable transformation how Britain, that was once the king of the road, has become a pauper in this regard. It's not that we don't buy cars, it's not that we don't need cars. We do both in profusion. We just don't make them ourselves anymore. Somebody else is making them. It's a sign of the manufacturing decline of Britain. When I was not young, but in my 20s, 30s, Britain had a car industry, a truck industry, a motorbike industry, a steel industry, a coal industry, a shipbuilding industry. We were the workshop of the world right up until the 1970s. Now, I'm afraid we're bargain basement. Pound shop are us, if you get my drift. So, in this broadcast, back in the studio, I'm going to look at the reasons why our cars became uglier and less British. Take a look around this show with me. This was the real people's car, the Trabant of the German Democratic Republic. Long gone, like the Trabant. You can almost, in fact you can, smell the leather, even through the camera. This was my family car throughout my childhood. My father drove it until there were holes in the floor. He used to joke that it was like the Flintstones. You had to run in order to get the car to move. Many a time I saw him using the starting handle, thinking he was going to have a heart attack on cold mornings, turning this engine into life. And we traveled everywhere, all over Britain, all over Ireland, a whole family in this little baby Austin. Austin of England. I briefly had one of these in Austin, Cambridge. I bought it for £100 and it broke down after a few days and was irrecoverable. Worst buy I ever made, but it's a beautiful car. Inspector Morse's car. Not literally, but the car he drove. Beautiful old Jag. This is the Austin Allegro. It sums up the decline of Austin. This was near the beginning of the end. I had two of them. They were absolutely awful cars, as well as being pot ugly. G, it's a British classic. A Vauxhall. The once humble Vauxhall, now a thing of beauty. Another Vauxhall. Don't make Vauxhalls like this anymore. You buy him, you get George Michael and sorry, the George Mitchell singers. Not George Michael. Yeah. And Pinky and Perky.
Look at the tax disc.
Wow.
Look at the tax disc.
1961.
He's gonna go.
It's the only one left in Britain of 1961. Average house price when this was made was £2,777. A pint of milk was 3p. And finally, the acme of British engineering, the Only Fools and Horses special three-wheeler. Whatever happened to three-wheelers? They used to be really common. At football matches, there was a big row of them. Disabled people used to get. It's a Rialto. Fancy name. I was hoping my sons would pledge an E-Type Jaguar to me, but instead they pledged that Rialto, the three-wheeler that we saw in the car park at the end. I could speak for hours on this subject. That would be a liberty because not everyone is interested in it. But let me sketch one or two ideas that I hope you'll respond to, either in writing or on the telephone lines, and perhaps we can return on another occasion to them. I'm posing, first of all, aesthetic questions. How did we go from the Austin Cambridge to the Austin Allegro? How did the makers of the Austin A30, the baby Austin that I practically lived in as a child, right up until my teenage years, that was way in advance of the Mini, by the way. So Austin was already making a mini car, albeit rounded rather than a square. How did that company go from there to the Allegro? How did the MG disappear? How did the Sunbeam Talbot disappear? How did the Jowett Javelin, made in Bradford, disappear? Why did the Mayflower wilt? Why did the Ford Anglia, all edges and wings and fins and a thing of beauty, where did it go, my lovely? What happened to you, Ford Angela, as we used to call them? Why did cars get ugly? It doesn't cost less to make an ugly car than it does to make a beautiful one, does it? Of course I know about the quadrupling of the oil price in 1973 from practically nothing to, 4 times practically nothing. But as Professor Hankey just told us, since 1973, we've had a more or less constant flow of oil, petrol, and the price has been relatively stable. Some prices have risen far more than the price of petrol and gasoline. For example, the house prices in 1961, average house price in Britain, 2,777, whereas the pint of milk has gone up from 3p. The reality is, it isn't explicable only by the need to reduce energy consumption. It isn't explicable only by the need to use lighter materials. I mean, I look at cars that cost hundreds of thousands of pounds that I'm sorry to say my sons seem to admire. To me, they're like fiberglass plastic trash compared to the motor cars I was just looking at there that are, of course, solid steel. So it's not, in my view, entirely explicable for economic reasons. Something has happened to our aesthetic, and that which you could say the same about railway engines That which was beautiful is now ugly. It seems to me a metaphor for the cheapening, coarsening of what's happened to us over that time. I may be being sentimental and romantic, but I defy anyone to look at the Triumph Herald, the Triumph Sprite, the Triumph Dolomite, and look at what we have today. I defy anyone to look at that Sunbeam Talbot or the 1960 MG open top that I don't think was in the film, but which I spent a lot of time talking to the owner who's trying to sell it to me for $30,000, but I told him I'm not best placed right now. I defy anyone to say that that which came before was not much more beautiful, pleasing on the eye, pleasing to the user than what we have now. Now, of course, people say, well, mod cons, safety functions, you know, seat belts and ABS and automatic transmission and heaters and air conditioning and CD players and so on. But of course, our designers could easily have, as time passed on, adjusted the design of these beautiful cars to include mod cons and safety functions and so on that we no longer have. As to why fewer and fewer are British, I'm being told in my ear, I've already spoken long enough, I may have to return to that another night, but the truth is, in my lifetime, which, you know, it's not short, but it's not that long, we have gone from being the workshop of the world, building ships of steel, our own steel, in furnaces fueled by our own coal, ships that sailed the world with laden with our manufactures. We have gone from that to where we are now. Bargain basement, pound shops, recipients of other people's inward investment, if we're lucky, and of course, entirely dependent on its continuation. When we were king, British capitalism performed atrociously. It had atrocious industrial relations through its grotesquely poor management. It exported a massive proportion of the capital it accumulated to make more short-term profits overseas in other markets where the workers worked almost for nothing. It invested fantastically little in R&D, research and development, when other capitalist countries were doing the precise opposite. Were investing their capital at home, were particularly front-loading their economies with R&D investment and research, where universities were studying engineering instead of media studies, instead of studying Hogwarts and Harry Potter at university, you studied how to turn a piece of steel into a thing of beauty that would be a joy forever. These are just some of my thoughts. I'm still thinking about that tour of that field in Cheshire yesterday. It makes me sad that our country has come to this.